Thank you all for coming. I hope you've had a productive and informative experience so far, and I hope this panel, I'm sure this panel is going to be interesting. I was a public defender for 4 years before I came here, so these are issues that are really near and dear to my heart and that are incredibly important and disproportionately affect the Black community. So you did not come here to hear me speak, so I'm going to move it over to the panel. But thank you again, and definitely we're looking forward to your questions.
All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I'm Ron Sullivan. I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Law School, and I'm delighted to moderate today's panel. Prior to becoming an academic many years ago, I was a public defender as well in Washington, D.C., and these issues continue to be important to me, both politically but also in terms of my scholarly work. I have the pleasure of introducing a fantastic panel. Now, their full bios are in your printed material, so I'm just going to do the bare minimum highlight so that we have enough time to really get into the issue of mass incarceration. So to my immediate left and your right, we have Ken Duncan. Ken, who also went to Morehouse with me as an undergrad.
All right.
Another Morehouse man in there? All right. Can always tell a Morehouse man. So Ken Duncan is a Democrat serving the people of the 5th District as a state representative in the Illinois General Assembly. Next to Ken, I want to get my notes here. Next to Ken, we have Jessica Eaglin. Jessica Eaglin is counsel in the Brennan Center Justice Program, where she works on the over-reliance on incarceration in the U.S. Next to Jessica, we have Julie Stewart. Julie Stewart is the president and founder of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization fighting for smart sentencing laws that maintain public safety. And next to Julie, we have David Peterson. David Peterson is an assistant federal public defender for the Western District of Texas. And finally, we have Benjamin Cheeks. Ben Cheeks is currently in private practice, specializing in criminal defense. Prior to that, he was an assistant U.S. attorney and an assistant district attorney. So, with that, let's delve into the substance of the program. I was scheduled to do a brief overview of this issue of mass incarceration. I'm going to truncate that in light of time to make sure that we get back on schedule. But one of the things I focus on in my personal scholarship at the law school is this issue of mass incarceration. And let me just say as an initial matter, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panel, that the United States, as many of you know, has the highest documented incarceration rate in the world. Period. That alone says a lot, and it should shock the conscience of rational thinking people that a so-called first world country, leads countries like, very repressive totalitarian regimes in incarceration. That's an issue that is a problem. Several years ago, in 2007, my former law school classmate was on an improbable campaign to be president and asked me to chair his criminal justice policy group to help formulate policy with for his campaign. And by the way, that period of time was probably our faculty at the Harvard Law School was probably the most unproductive several years in terms of faculty, because half the faculty was somehow involved in the campaign in one way or another. But I chaired the criminal justice policy group, and the title of today's talk is really appropriate because one of the things then Senator Obama, now President Obama, emphasized is that he wanted the country to be smart on crime, to be smart on crime. Right now, we are anything but. Having said that, the people to my left are very smart, and we are going to hear from them. So by way of structure, they're each going to do about a 5-minute opening. Then I'm going to ask questions of the panel, and we're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, a half hour. So we want to be sure that this is interactive and people get to ask questions, not give speeches, but ask questions. So we'll start with Representative Duncan.
Now, I'm a politician up here, Professor. I thought we were supposed to give speeches, right?
Yeah. Well, you can.
A microphone in front of a Chicago politician, in fact. I'm Ken Duncan, and I'm born and raised in the Cabrini Green housing development in Chicago. And that community, as you well know and probably familiar with, you've seen Good Times or Candyman, or for some of you who are over 40, Cooley High. I grew up in the environment where, actually I grew up during the pre-crack cocaine epidemic, and I reference that because that was when you had a community, our black community, that which was always anchored by predominantly women. Because us guys, we were off either maybe in the military, we were in jail, gay, or we were just rolling stones, if you will. But the black women have always anchored our respective community. But when that crack cocaine epidemic hit, that was the only time, and still to this day, when black women actually left their babies, wherever, chasing a little rock. And so that's a phenomenon in and of itself. And so it was during that crack cocaine era, and by the way, for 2 years, about maybe 3 years, there was no statutes against selling crack cocaine. And so you had this huge surge of black entrepreneurship with folk from all academic and educational levels in the hood, from boardrooms, a part of this fast grossing product. And then other folk found out about it. White folk in particular, the Reagans. And then that's when you saw all of these mandatory minimum laws to come about, because they were very, very clear and specific that, well, who was selling those drugs? Keep in mind, cocaine, white powder cocaine, had always been a part of the American culture since the Coca-Cola days. The original Coca-Cola was made with cocaine. Cocaine was the sort of the marijuana du jour from around the turn of the century in the roaring 20s and Shanghai and Berlin and Paris, and certainly here in America. You were extra and ultra cool within that regard. But then, again, the crack cocaine came about, and the laws just went out of this world. And so the trend, not only at the federal level, became a sort of war on drugs, or whatever Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan were talking about back then, that morphed into statewide further penalty enhancements, which resulted in the state of Illinois in a mass incarceration. And I tell people, I chair appropriations for higher ed. I also chair tourism and conventions. But here's what I know as a social worker. I got my social work degree from the University of Chicago. The amount of wealth that is consumed by your public tax-paying dollars and the private sector as a whole is healthcare, under the rubric of education, and crime. Crime does pay. And so when you have legislators, for example, in our state, that were dogmatic on enhancing penalties for small rocks, they, in some cases, took what the federal levels were of statutory minimums were to a whole other level. It was just a massive incarceration movement in the state of Illinois for the last 25 years. Just now, because of conscientious folk, and particularly the Black Caucus, where I chair the House and Senate, we've made this our initiative to reform not just sort of this piecemeal approach, for example, that our mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who, because he couldn't get a handle on the shootings last year and the year before, His only thing was for UUW, unlawful use of a weapon, was to enhance or lock up people more. That was his MO. Because he and Gary McCarthy simply had no clue on what to do with dealing with black on black crime. And so we, the Black Caucus in particular, fought that tooth and nail last year and were very successful. Now, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, we formed a joint Senate and House Democratic Republican conference committee to reform our entire criminal justice system, which is a major success for us. Well, I thought it would have been a sort of a new or fancy situation for us, but anytime you have the state of Texas, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and other states where they have severe penalty enhancements, even if you're jaywalking, we're finally coming about it. And I told the speaker the other day, I said, the reason that the governor and others are talking about reducing the mandatory minimums or reforming the criminal justice or agreeing with us is because it's costing money. And see, when white folk start losing money, that's when they want to start trying to come up with a fix. And the fact of the matter is, in every state legislature, and I'm talking very candidly, so if you don't want me to talk about black and white, I'm from Chicago. We don't whisper when we speak in that vein. Every state General Assembly or legislature is predominantly white, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. And they communicate with each other in sort of white folk code talk when it comes to locking Negroes up, and those bills, they fly through. It happens at the federal level as well. So why is it out of the 68,000 people who are locked up in the state of Illinois, 75% of those people look like myself and darker? Why is it that out of 45% of the Chicago public school system, well, blacks compose of the 42% of the population of Chicago public schools, there were 75% of those who were arrested for really non-violent offenses, or were suspended, or expelled. So what does that lead us towards? And so our General Assembly, our House and Senate in the state of Illinois, we are keenly aware, and we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, as Fannie Lou Hamer pointed out. It's time to act. Because yesterday it was my cousin and niece and them. Tomorrow, today, it could be Ken Duncan and one of you all here, whether you're a student at Harvard or not. Because with all your wonderful credentials that we share collectively, it means nothing when a police officer who is accustomed, or who is a part of the nomenclature in a particular community, which is anywhere USA, to arresting your black butts up. So we are marching forward, and we are looking very, very aggressively to making sure that we play off of the cost factor, but the social injustice component of massive incarceration. It's a new paradigm that we have to shift towards, and I'm here to learn and engage you, sort of this new fresh new energy of and bevy of idea with this esteemed panel. So, good afternoon.
Thank you, Representative. Jessica.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. My name is Jessica Eaglin. I'm at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. The Brennan Center is a part public policy, part law institute. Oh, thank you. Part law institute that focuses on improving our systems of justice and democracy in the United States. And we are, among other organizations, focused on reducing mass incarceration. Just to give a little bit more context to the problem of mass incarceration, so not only is the United States the #1 incarcerator in the world, but we also constitute a very small percentage of the entire world population. So we constitute 5% of the world's total population, but we have 25% of all individuals who are incarcerated in the world, incarcerated in the United States. And so that statistic kind of brings to life this problem that we're talking about. And what the Brennan Center is really focused on doing is bringing that issue to the public. Because even though we know that we have this large prison population, and we know that it costs a lot of money, the regular everyday person doesn't understand what mass incarceration is and how mass incarceration affects them personally, even if you're not incarcerated, even if your cousin's not incarcerated, even if your family members and your friends have never been in contact with the criminal justice system, mass incarceration affects you too. And so we have, I guess, a four-prong approach Our ultimate message, or our ultimate goal is to say public opinion spurred the policies that drive mass incarceration, and only public opinion can bring an end to those policies that created mass incarceration. And so our challenge is to bring this problem to the public, and not the public that's super educated like everyone on this panel with me, or everyone in this, in this room here today, but that the everyday layperson can understand what this problem is. So it's, the first prong is exposing the epidemic and explaining the ways that mass incarceration touches us all. So, statistics like 1 in 3 Black men can anticipate being incarcerated in their lifetime. That is a real statistic today. And the fact that 25% of, 700,000 individuals are released from prison every year. And the majority of them are not able to obtain a job. They're not able to vote. They're not able to influence public policy in the ways that we believe are, natural and just in our democratic society. 5.3 million individuals can't vote today because they have been disenfranchised because of their criminal records. These statistics have such a real impact on particularly the Black community, but on Americans just in general. So bringing that, exposing that this policy, or exposing that mass incarceration is an epidemic that exists, and then pushing towards systemic reforms that will reduce the size of our prison population, because it's not enough to say, it costs a lot of money to incarcerate. So for this 1 year, we're going to shorten individual sentences for particular drug offenders that meet very, very narrow criteria, because mass incarceration is a problem that can persist. And while there's a lot of momentum right now because of the fiscal crisis that we have experienced since 2008 or so, there is momentum to try and squeeze pennies out of the criminal justice system. But while that trend exists now, unless we understand the, social justice aspect of mass incarceration, we are always kind of in a position of to easily revert, very easily revert. And the Brennan Center's kind of goal is to prevent that. And then also to expose the ways that mass incarceration doesn't promote public safety, and in fact can hinder public safety. Exactly. So, you talk about the recidivism rate. You've got 60% of individuals who've been incarcerated going back to prison in 3 years. And does that have to do with people committing new crimes? Not really. And then when you talk about, when you talk in scholarly circles, there's a consensus that we've reached a tipping point where so many individuals are pulled out of certain communities, particularly communities of color, particularly poor communities in inner cities, where it has this destabilizing effect, where you're actually, if you incarcerate more people will be incarcerated, because there is no community for these individuals to rely on. And so at some point, it makes sense to stop incarcerating, stop taking people out of communities. But that's a reality that, isn't actually accepted by the general public. And so we do a lot of research and data collection to illustrate this reality. We have a report coming out on the crime rate, and the fact that the crime rate has dropped precipitously since the 1990s, and that, in fact, some of the states that have the largest decrease, New York being one of them, the largest decrease in their prison population, have also had the largest decrease in their crime rates. And that is not a coincidence. That is because these states had reached a tipping point, or continue to dance along this tipping point of incarceration and public safety. And so we do a lot of work. Also, my personal passion is sentencing reform, and I'm going to leave that for Julie, so she can explain that in more detail. But we do a lot of work around trying to literally reduce the length of prison sentences, because there are 2 factors that have led to the rise in our prison population. When you really get to it, it's the number of people who are going into prison and the length of sentences that they're actually serving. And those have increased exponentially at the same time that the prison populations have. And I will close for the moment just saying that this problem exists particularly at the federal level. So at the federal level, the prison population has grown without stop since 1980, and it has increased by 700%. And the federal population, the federal prison system, is the largest incarcerator in the United States. This is not a reality that we experienced prior to the 1980s, and so much of that has to do with drug sentencing and our policies around drug policy in the United States. So certainly when President Obama came into office, it's wonderful that he wants to be smart on crime. He picked the perfect office to be smart on crime in, because the federal system needs improvement in some ways, most of all. And I know we have others on the panel who can talk a little bit about what's going on in the states, but because of the financial realities of incarceration, or of mass incarceration, numerous states have actually taken modest steps to reduce the size of their prison populations, New York being one of them. Again, I mean, I'm from New York, I have to give us plugs where they're due. And while the states have taken these steps, the federal government has been very slow to adopt similar reforms, and that has led to a crisis, particularly after sequestration, a crisis at the federal level in terms of financial funding for the Bureau of Prisons and for indigent defense and for the functioning of our judiciary. So this is a crisis that affects us all, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much. Julie Stewart.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for that nice introduction, Ron, and thank you for inviting me, Amy. It's great to be here and see so many people who care about these issues and hopefully will help us change them. My name is Julie Stewart. I'm the president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums. It's a pretty self-evident organization. We oppose mandatory minimum sentencing laws. I came to this issue personally when my brother was arrested for growing marijuana in 1990, and he was put into the federal system, which is weird because he was growing marijuana in his garage outside of Spokane, Washington. There wasn't a real reason to kick his case into the federal system, but many small-time cases get put in the federal system. He was guilty, pled guilty, and the judge was forced to sentence him to 5 years in federal prison. The judge said at the time, I don't want to give you this sentence, but my hands are tied by the mandatory minimum sentences that Congress passed in 1986. At the time, I was working at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. It's a libertarian think tank. Some of you may be familiar with it. And when this happened to Jeff, I was stunned, not just that his life was so off track and that he was doing something that was leading nowhere, or even that he would have to serve 5 years in prison, but the fact that the judge had no discretion. And the judge said at sentencing, if it were up to me, I'd give you 2 years in prison, but I can't. So I'm not a lawyer. I only have a BA, no graduate degree up here, but it seemed to me that our American justice system was on its head, that the judge is supposed to judge, and that given all the information about the individual, they're supposed to determine what the appropriate sentence is. That no longer happens in crimes that carry a mandatory minimum sentence. And we use that term as if everyone knows what that means. Do you basically know what it means? It basically means that, and mandatory minimums are not new. If you look back at the history of federal mandatory minimums in particular, they read like the crime du jour. You can see what the public was concerned about at the time, and then what Congress did to fix the problem by creating a mandatory prison sentence. So as early as the 1790s, piracy got you a sentence of life without parole in the federal system. In the 1830s, refusal to hang a telegraph wire on your property, it was like 6 months in prison. Horse thievery at some point. So I mean, it's actually a fascinating look, and if you're really interested, go to the U.S. Sentencing Commission's website, and they have a whole list of them. So does FAM's website, actually. And so you can see that when the public had a headline that was disturbing to them, Congress reacted by creating mandatory sentences. So the ones that we are focusing on right now and that this panel has talked about so far are the ones that were passed in 1986, which was the height of the crime war, the war on drugs, rather, excuse me. And crack cocaine was a new drug. It was a drug that had a lot of myth surrounding it, which is not to say that it wasn't a dangerous drug, just like any other drug, but there was so much hype and misunderstanding about it. So in 1986, which also happened to be an election year, there were sort of the three things that I think drove the establishment of the current mandatory minimum sentences. for drugs is that crack cocaine was a new drug on the scene. Those of you old enough to remember this might remember that every night on the news it would talk about crack babies. You try it once, you're addicted for life. I mean, there was a lot of misunderstanding about crack. Secondly, Len Bias, the basketball star from the University of Maryland, died of a cocaine overdose. It was cocaine, not crack cocaine, but it was completely misunderstood. He was a star. It was in Congress's backyard. He was being drafted to the Celtics, actually, and went out to celebrate and overdosed on powder cocaine. And that was an enormous event in Washington's backyard. And third, it was an election year. So members of Congress, just like they have historically, decided, this is of huge interest to the public, this, crack epidemic and this drug problem, and we're going to create these stiff mandatory prison sentences, and that's going to solve our problem. Well, obviously it didn't. And one of my board members was on the Judiciary Committee of the House at the time that these laws were passed, and he said it was like a poker game, so that one member of Congress would say, well, for 5 grams of crack cocaine, let's make it a 2-year sentence. And the next one would say, no, let's make it 3. No, 4. There was no analysis done, no prison impact analysis, no racial impact analysis, nothing, no research done. These laws were picked out of the sky. And those penalties are still the penalties we are dealing with today, by and large, at the federal level. And I just want to fast forward for a minute to get to sort of the Obama piece of my spiel here, because as much as we all, I think, probably everyone in this room, hoped that as President Obama took office, he would bring changes that many of us want in all the areas that we care about. I worried about it at the time. I remember saying to my husband, he can't possibly live up to everything we're expecting of him. And to be honest with you, he's been a big disappointment in the field of criminal justice for those of us who work in it very closely. However, in his first term, he did do something that is hugely important, and that was to change crack cocaine penalties. And he had the support of his Attorney General, Eric Holder, and they together, I think, did lead this sort of quietly behind the scenes. We actually, my organization works on doing a lot of different things. We have grassroots support. The director of our Massachusetts project, Barbara Dugan, is here working in Massachusetts on state sentencing. But we also do a very good job of sort of bridging the right and left gap, partly because of my own background that has a lot of libertarian connections. So we got a letter written from all these super conservatives supporting that bill, the crack cocaine reforms, that provided some political cover. Members of Congress amazingly passed that crack bill, which instead of 5 grams of crack triggering a 5-year sentence, and if you picture a gram being like 5 sweet and low packages, now it's 28 grams of crack. Bizarre number, don't ask me why. Senator Durbin and Senator Sessions were in the locker room in the Senate working out together when they came up with this number of 28 grams will now trigger your 5-year sentence. I mean, that was actually something I knew kind of as a rumor, and then I was on a panel with Senator Durbin the other day, and he said it out loud in front of everybody. I was like, really, you want to admit this in public? But that's the way our penalties get made. Okay, so as a result of this, as a result of the fact that now 28 grams triggers a 5-year sentence and 280 grams triggers a 10-year sentence, the ratio between powder and crack cocaine is no longer 100 to 1, it's an 18 to 1 difference. This is all very technical and not so important sort of in some ways, although it's terribly important in the number of years someone serves behind bars as a result of this change. And then my last point before I turn this over is one of the things that was troubling to us when that bill passed in 2010 was that it was not made retroactive. It did not apply to anybody who's in prison today. And overwhelmingly, the people serving crack cocaine penalties in the federal system are African American, something like 85, 86%. And the stories that we told, which is one of the things we do best, is tell stories about how these laws impact people's lives. The people whose stories we told, who were already behind bars, did not benefit from this reform. So there is a bill introduced now called the Smarter Sentencing Act. It's S1410 in the Senate. I forget the House number. It's by Senator Durbin and Senator Lee. It's a left-right combination. Senator Lee's a Republican from Utah. It's a bill that has 3 parts to it. One of the parts is to make the crack cocaine piece, crack cocaine retroactive. The laws that passed in 2010 would be applied retroactively to those people left behind in prison. It would affect about 8,800 people in prison. It's a big number of people. And their sentences would be reduced. I don't remember the exact average. I think it's around 20 months, something like that. But that means some people would have a much bigger reduction. Some people would have smaller. So we are actively promoting that. I would be happy to talk to you about that bill and more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David Peterson.
Thank you, everyone. As mentioned, I'm an assistant federal public defender in the Western District of Texas, so I'm just sort of on the line watching my clients be affected by these issues at the one-by-one level. I have been told by my boss to make clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of my organization. But that's good, because that means that I get to say what I really think. So part of the focus of this panel is Obama's policy and what in the federal system we talk about and think of as Holder's policy, or answer, as it's in quotes in the panel title, to mass incarceration. And we've heard, I think, some really great sounding stuff that really gives great hope. The fact that we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners, Holder is saying that. The fact that our policies have put too many young black men in jail and destroyed black communities, Holder is willing to say that. Now, the question becomes, and where I have a little bit of insight just on the day-to-day, what are his policy proposals actually doing right now at the local levels? One proposal that he, it really, if you hear what he's saying publicly, it sounds like Julie has gotten his ear and he's fully on board with her. She's just convinced him with her 20 plus years of work. He says we need to stop sending low-level, nonviolent drug offenders to prison for long periods of time. We need to not charge them with mandatory minimums. That's great. What I want to talk to you briefly about is some key flaws in the policy that I think need to be addressed, hopefully through questions, hopefully through people working on it today. I want to say that the exposing, in my view, has worked. We're finally having, I think, a national conversation about it. The momentum is now, but the work is by no means done. The questions that I think are very important to ask, and I didn't know Professor Sullivan's background, so maybe he can just answer this, but why was this so slow in coming? Although the crack reduction in Obama's first term was modest, but nonetheless very important, other than that, we basically heard mum on criminal justice policy until 4.5 years into the Obama administration. There was no broad policy announcement about this until August 2013. So when Eric Holder says we have too many people going to jail for too long for no good reason, I think a lot of my clients, a lot of the people that have been going to jail over the last 4.5 years are wondering, why now? And I think that's an important question to ask. Another thing that's not really the topic of this panel, but I think that it's very important to ask ourselves why Holder is saying nothing about the single most prosecuted federal crime, which is illegal re-entry after deportation. It does not carry mandatory minimum sentences, but it carries very harsh penalties, and it has incarcerated it has basically turned the status of being an undocumented immigrant into a crime, and it is a mass incarceration crisis. And when you look at the Holder policy, there is the policy memo, the Smart on Crime memo, there's not a word spoken about it. In fact, when he speaks, he specifically says there are too many Americans going to jail for too long for no good reason. He has excluded an entire portion of the federal prison population from the policy change, and I think we need to ask why and what we can do to include those folks in our conversation. And then the last thing is just a little bit of nuts and bolts that from an insider's sort of local perspective, I want to tell the tale of two districts. I used to work in California where Mr. Cheeks works. I now work in Texas, and there is a massive difference in how these reforms are playing out at the local level. The Federal Sentencing Commission, which has been mentioned here, tracks the length of sentences, and I can give you all the statistics, but essentially what I can say is the vast majority of clients in my new district, in the Western District of Texas, are sentenced within federal sentencing guidelines, and many other districts, including California, including our a nice district here of Massachusetts, including New York, our neighbors to the south here, the vast majority of people are getting reductions from the sentencing guidelines. There's the question as to why that is, why the South and Texas have fallen behind, I think is something that has been the subject. It hasn't fallen behind, has failed to catch up, has been the subject of a lot of scholarly writing. I think it's intricately tied to the South and to Texas's history with slavery, with racism, and I think that what that means at the policy level, and the question to ask Eric Holder and the question to push the issue to push him on, is that we have to stop at the federal level giving local prosecutors, the U.S. attorneys who are appointed by the president, so much discretion. And they have to, when Holder says we need to stop sending so many people to prison, he has to not say, and I leave it up to each individual U.S. attorney to decide what they mean, what I mean when I say a low-level nonviolent drug offender. He has to give concrete guidance and deal with dissent in order to actually achieve the change where it most needs to occur. Because I can tell you for a fact, when Holder announced last August that they were no longer going to charge low-level nonviolent offenders with mandatory minimum sentences, every prosecutor in my district thought, well, we don't charge low-level nonviolent offenders. They all think that they're charging high-level people. And so we have to address the defensiveness of the prosecutors, of local prosecutors, and actually have a national policy. That's all I've got to say for right now.
Wonderful. Benjamin Cheeks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin Cheeks. Currently, right now, I'm a defense attorney. My practice is generally federal practice, and it deals mostly with drug crimes. My introductory remarks is basically the evolution and education of myself. What happened when I was growing up, I grew up in South Florida in a very bad neighborhood, and everyone that I knew was a victim of some type of crime. There was a larceny, robbery, murder, attempted murder. That was around me at all times. And even myself, I was a victim of many of those crimes. And those instances drove me to want to become a prosecutor. And I was a prosecutor for a decade, over a decade. And recently, I left the prosecutor's office and I started my own practice. But when I went to law school, I knew that I wanted to be a criminal prosecutor based on the instances that happened to me in the past. And when I got the job at the Manhattan DA's office, I was overjoyed because I thought that I would have the opportunity to work on behalf of people, on behalf of victims that were victims just like myself or my family or my friends as I was growing up. But when I got there, what I realized is that that wasn't happening as much as I thought it would happen. What the biggest problem was the drug problem. Most of my cases when I was at the DA's office for 7 years were drug crimes. And of those drug crimes, almost all of them were minority, either black or Hispanic. And while I was there, I did probably 1,000 cases, at least 1,000 drug cases. And of those 1,000 drug cases, there was probably 1 or 2 white defendants that I had. Out of 1,000, only 2 of them were white. Now, you and I, all of us know that white people do drugs too, right? So what's the problem? What was the problem? I mean, I didn't really understand why I kept seeing my people over and over and over again. So I'm at the table looking over at someone else that looks like me or my brother or my cousin, wondering why am I doing this? How can I keep doing this? I'm not doing what I wanted to. I'm not helping those people that were victims of rape or theft or robbery or anything like that. That's what I was really passionate about. But time and time again, I was looking at people that had problems, had drug problems. They weren't violent people, but they did crack, they did cocaine, they did whatever drug that they did. But a lot of times that's not their fault. I mean, if I were to try heroin right now, I would be trying heroin again in next week because it's addictive. It's not their fault. And so I got upset. And so I decided I need to leave the DA's office. And my suggestion to myself was, why don't I go federal? Things will be much better on the federal level. The evolution of me, the education of me. So I got the job at the at the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Diego, and I was overjoyed. My wife, my beautiful wife, who's right there, standing in the second row. Go ahead, wave your hand, sweetie, wave your hand. There you go. She wanted to move to San Diego, and so I got a job in San Diego. And I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office there for 3 years. And of those 3 years, two and a half of those years, I was seeing the same thing over and over again. I was like, what is this? This is ridiculous. Even the sentences that were there, they were blowing my mind. Back in New York, people were regularly getting 18 to 36 months for nonviolent offenses. No criminal history, 18 to 36 months, year and a half, 3 years. Same crime, a little bit more narcotics, but nonviolent, no criminal history, they're routinely getting 36 to 72 months. 72 months in jail. So I have to go into court because my job is to be a federal prosecutor and represent the United States. Benjamin Cheeks on behalf of the United States. And I asked the judge to do 72 months for someone. And he agrees. And I say to myself, that wasn't right. That wasn't right. So I was a part of the problem. I was a part of the problem. I can admit that. Now, while I was there, fortunately, after 2.5 years I was there, I saw a change. If someone had asked me if President Obama had done anything up until that point, I would have said he did absolutely nothing, and it's ridiculous and nothing is going to change. But back in last August, Eric Holder, he told us, he mandated us at the time, the Assistant United States Attorneys, that we're not going to do minimum mandatory sentences anymore. And I was in the office. We had an office meeting similar to this. Management's up front. Someone tells us that we're not going to do minimum mandatory sentences anymore. All of a sudden, 3 people go, oh my God, we can't do our job anymore.
Oh, yeah?
How are we expected to do our jobs? And I'm like, what? What are you talking about? That's a mandatory 10-year sentence. Mandatory 10 years. If someone imports 50 grams of methamphetamine, mandatory 10 years. 50 grams of meth, 10 years. And so I went to this person afterwards, one of the people that was upset about the Holder's instruction to us. And I said, why are you so upset? We went to his office. And I went to his office and I talked to him. And he literally picked up a folder and he threw it across the room. He said, how am I going to get people to cooperate? I can't get them to snitch if I can't hold over their head 10 years in prison. And I thought to myself, I got to get out of here. I got to go. This is not for me. I've been the problem for far too long. And this is ridiculous. And so there was talk around the office, and other people felt varying degrees of that same gentleman that I spoke to. And I was on the far end of the spectrum. I was like, woohoo, this is great. Now, more minorities will be spending less time in jail. And that's what I wanted to fight for. That was behind my decision to leave prosecution altogether, to stop being the problem, and to fight for minorities who were being prosecuted.
Great, thank you very much. So, Jessica Eaglin, let's start with you. So let's just pretend I'm a Martian, and I come down to Earth, and the first thing I do is read the newspaper, and I see something about mass incarceration, and people are complaining about it, and I see some of the stats that you mentioned. U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the prison population. 1 in 3 black men are somehow involved in the criminal justice system. So to the first number, I'm a Martian. I don't know anything about anything on Earth, and I say, well, this data simply show that Americans commit more crimes, or more criminally disposed. The numbers are the numbers. What do you say to me?
So the question is, what does a Martian think? What do you understand? What do these statistics tell you as a Martian about the United States? I think that they would probably say, I mean, I would say to you, we have a problem that we don't know how to address. And that problem isn't necessarily committing more crimes, because when you actually look at the violence, the statistics around violence, and I don't know the exact numbers, but what I do know is that we aren't far out of proportion to other countries, except for when it comes to, you know, gun violence, and there's no surprise there because we're allowed to carry guns when other countries are not. So the problem it's not about committing crime, it's about something else, which leads me to the second statistic, which is, you know, this 1 in 3, you know, African American men are likely to be, you know, in some kind of contact with the criminal justice system. Well, if I was a Martian, I would think, well, this must be what they do with black people, because that's where most of them are. And you know what? If I was a Martian, I might go to Florida and I'd ask somebody there and they'd say the same thing. You ask somebody in Florida and they'd say, well, you know, black people are supposed to be in a particular space, and that the criminal justice system regulates those spaces in certain ways, and that mass incarceration is really about not having a solution to what to do with poor people, who are disproportionately people of color, and uneducated people, or I guess, you know, less access to education, people who have mental diseases, people who have drug addiction. This must be what Americans do with those people, because they have no other solution.
So, Julie Stewart, same thing. I'm trying to figure this thing out, what's going on Earth, and I follow up, I hear Jessica, and I follow up with this 1 in 3 stat and say, well, another rational conclusion is that black men in this part of the world, this part on Earth, for whatever reason, simply commit more crimes. Those numbers in and of themselves don't tell me anything. What do you say?
It's such an education. Well, for one thing, you know, 5 times as many whites use drugs as African Americans in this country.
Say that again?
5 times as many whites use drugs as African Americans. Okay? But African Americans go to prison at 10 times the rate as whites. So it's who we're choosing to. It's selectively choosing who we're going to prosecute. And I think that there's lots of reasons for that. I think that, you know, certainly during the heyday of the crack wars, a lot of the drug dealing was done in the open street, in an open market. There were turf wars over, you know, neighborhood corners, and that led to a lot of violence. It was much easier to find somebody and arrest them on a street corner than it is to go into some white community behind a gated wall and find the people that are snorting cocaine. So that's one answer. The statistic is misleading. It's not that more black people commit more crime, it's that they're the ones who are being prosecuted and convicted.
So, Benjamin Cheeks, let me follow up with you on that. So, Julie Stewart says much of this has to do with over-policing, and let's say that I agree with that. And further, I mean, let's say I can tell you what, I'd be willing to bet that we could find as much drug use here on Harvard's campus as we can in Dorchester or Roxbury, but it's policed different, right? So, as a prosecutor, some will say, and perhaps rightly, that all I can do is prosecute what comes before me. If these cases come before me and they violate the federal law or the state law, depending on where you practice, then I have an obligation to prosecute. Is there anything that a prosecutor's office can do about this phenomena of over-policing in certain areas, certain neighborhoods?
Well, speaking not for the office that I used to work for, of course. There are resources in which the prosecutor's office can ask law enforcement to go to a particular area. Like the office does not just react to cases. They do proactive investigations in which I tell an FBI agent, or FBI agent comes to me and tells me that there's some white collar crime going on somewhere. Then I can tell that agent to go investigate that, and hopefully we can bring a case that way. So it's not just reactive. I think it's easier for people of color to be treated as though they're criminals more easily. They're more accessible. They're easier to get to. It's way easier to prosecute a drug crime, find drugs on a person, than the Wolf of Wall Street and do like a white collar thing. You guys see that movie? Yeah. That guy did less time in jail than probably everyone I've ever prosecuted. And he took money from thousands of people, millions of dollars from thousands of people. That's not fair. It's less work to get drug dealers in jail than it is to do white collar crime. And that's a truth. That is a fact. It's an unfortunate fact. And because it's less work, it's done less often.
But as a line prosecutor, presumably you can't say, you know what, I've been prosecuting too many of these blue-collar folks. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to prosecute him as a line attorney.
No, not at all. You have to do what's given to you. If the cases come to your desk and you're told to prosecute this case. If you don't like the case or you think there's problems with the case, you go to your supervisor. You say, supervisor, I think we got a problem here. A, B, C, D. Supervisor agrees or disagrees. Let's say he disagrees. Suck it up, you got to go do the case.
Can I just add something? My husband worked in the Manhattan DA's office when he first got out of law school, and he had the same impression you did, that just a sea of brown faces, that he was on the wrong side of it. But he got a nickname of Discon Ron because he would bring everything down to disorderly conduct. So you could do that. You could like just, kind of make sure that the worst charge you can lay on him is disorderly conduct.
Yeah, can I follow up on that?
Yeah. You got the nickname too. Huh?
While I was a federal prosecutor, I was the more liberal prosecutor in the office. I'm not quite sure if I was the most, but I was definitely on that end of the spectrum. And I used to have cases, and Amy Kapoor, who's sitting right there, she was a federal defender, so she was on different cases with me. So, and I have the feeling, no one has told me this, but I have the feeling that when someone got me on the case, they were relieved that I was on the case, because you can do certain things in terms of pleading things down or modifying the charge within the limits of the law. You can take it down, or you can give some points off for some reductions for the plea agreement. But in terms of like not doing the case because you don't agree with who's being prosecuted, that's out of the question.
Right, so David Peterson, let's talk about some potential areas of civil disobedience that the defense bar can engage in. So Michelle Alexander, who's the author of The New Jim Crow, did a provocative New York Times piece relatively recently, and where she said defense attorneys should band together and bring every case, insist on a trial in every case. And if they do, it will grind the system to a halt, and basically that'll teach them. Michelle's obviously a wonderful scholar and a great colleague. I'm not sure she's tried a criminal case before, but would that work?
Well, for starters, I was going to suggest that your Martian read her book to try and understand some of the questions that you're asking. It's a great book, The New Jim Crow. Another book with a similar viewpoint on the South in Texas is called Texas Tough.
That's great.
The Martian should definitely read those. Lawyers sit around and talk about that all the time. As we've seen mass incarceration, it seems like the easiest solution is to say, they're overwhelming the system, we could overwhelm it even more by having every client go to trial. Now, there's a short answer of why we don't encourage our clients to do that and can't, which is an ethical duty to an individual client. I can't have an individual client, I can't put an individual client up on a cross to say, hey, you're going to be part of what's going to grind the system to a halt. Sorry, instead of getting 7 years, you might get 15. But hey, it'll be worth it if you can get a bunch of other people to agree to do this. Maybe they won't be able to prosecute as many cases next month, the month after. Maybe they'll rethink their policy. It's unethical to that client. You have duties to communicate plea offers, and frankly, when a client has a plea offer that is in their own individual benefit, they oftentimes don't want to, and rightly so, don't want to throw themselves into the gears of justice to be ground up. There is an extreme trial penalty in the federal system, and I think that is a place where the policy change has to happen at the congressional level, changing the penalties, eliminating or reducing mandatory minimums. It has to happen in prosecutor's office because they have so much say over how to charge a case. I have clients right now who are charged with methamphetamine and they have 2 previous marijuana convictions. They're felonies to be sure, but they're just marijuana possession convictions. Because of the quantity of methamphetamine my client had, he's facing a charge of 10 years to life. If he were to go to trial, the prosecutor could enhance his sentence, in fact, not just to 20 year to life, couldn't just double him up, but could give him a mandatory life penalty. Life without parole. All life sentences in the federal system are life without parole. So how do I tell that client, hey, why don't you go to trial on this case where you were guilty, you confessed, in order to try and slow down drug prosecutions and spend the rest of your life in jail when you're hoping to get back to your family in 10 or so years.
So,
Can I make a
yeah,
real
go
quick?
ahead.
Just a little public messaging, education for everyone. 95% of offenders don't go to trial. So the vast majority of people who are in the criminal justice system never actually have a trial. They never go before a jury. And I mean, it's something that we all take for granted because we know what that means. But if you hadn't, had the opportunity to read Michelle Alexander's piece, I mean, that means that it always comes down to plea bargains. And the individuals who control the plea bargains are the U.S. attorneys or the district attorneys for a particular district. And so when we're talking about discretion, there's so much that they control in terms of deciding who goes to court or who gets sentenced and for what. So, sorry.
May I make a quick comment on discretion? Prosecutorial discretion is enormous, either at the state level and at the federal level. If a case came to my door, I could do with it so many different things that another prosecutor who got the same case wouldn't even be bothered to do because they're more conservative than I am. I would give points off to lessen the sentence, to try to give the person the sentence that I thought was appropriate. But if you were a more conservative or more aggressive prosecutor, they didn't do that. And so those prosecutors are somewhat feared within the office because they knew that just because their prosecutor got the case, then the penalty would be even higher. So I tried to be more lenient and more liberal and try to work with the defense bar to find a solution that was best for that individual person.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just have to jump in here. And that's one of the things that just drives us crazy, those of us who work on these issues. Conservatives particularly, who have opposed reforming any of the current laws, talk about, judges and how they're legislating by the bench and how they just, run amok and they have too much discretion, blah, blah, blah. What you just heard is the reality. The prosecutors now have the discretion. They have the discretion in how they choose to charge that case. They can charge it in a way that triggers a mandatory minimum sentence, or they can charge it in a way that doesn't. So that unreviewable power is what drives our penalties today. Whereas at least when it was the judge in the courtroom, in an open courtroom, everybody could see what was happening. This is completely behind closed doors. And so there always is discretion, it's just who has it. And now the discretion is housed behind closed doors in the U.S. Attorney's Office or the District Attorney's Office. That is not the American way. If we're going to have disparity in sentences, and we're going to, because there is no such thing as uniformity in sentences, and we have tried for 30 years to sort of, this holy grail of uniformity. It's not going to happen. It's not going to exist. There's always going to be disparity, but I'd rather have it be out front in the open where everybody knows where it is and where it can be challenged by either the defense attorney or the prosecution.
So I want to bring Ken Duncan into the conversation. And Ken, I wanted you to bet cleanup, because as we're talking about this issue of mass incarceration and the ways in which mandatory minimum sentences impact these numbers, it strikes me that this is particularly and peculiarly a legislative concern. Legislators write these mandatory minimum sentences. And as I tee up this question, I just would like to raise up something that Julie Stewart said. She used the term unreviewable power. And just to give context, because I know many here are not lawyers, that the charging decision, do I charge somebody with a life count or do I charge somebody with something, a period of 5 years? right, is a decision that our Supreme Court has said we will not look into. It's the power of the prosecutor. And that example comes from a case that I teach every year. A prosecutor said, I'm going to file life papers, mandatory life, habitual offender, or plead to 5 years. Now, under a rational actor theory, right, I would take that deal, even if I were innocent, right? Right? Who's going to risk the rest of their lives? I mean, that's rational, right? That's rational. Now, what happens, and this is where I want Ken to comment on, what happens is that it's very easy for legislators to write laws with just massive penalties under the theory that prosecutors are going to exercise discretion and not give every defendant the full brunt of those penalties. You think about the weight of the jail system now, it would be overflowing if they did that. But we live in a political economy where people say, well, we're tough on crime, so we're making this mandatory, making that mandatory, we're lengthening this and lengthening that. And people applaud that and they get reelected. How do we stop that cycle?
You're right on. It's first off, I would say that the reason Eric Holder is having this type of conversation or dialogue is because it's post the election. The president could speak towards some of the issues that I guess he feels pretty strongly about, or that he knows has been a systemic injustice for decades, or for hundreds of years in this case. And we can go back to post-slavery. Politicians' main job is to get reelected. I don't care who you talk to. I've been in since December 8/02. As in the Illinois House, I'm up every 2 years, or 18 months, I'm circulating petitions. And so we think about getting reelected, especially those of us who feel as if our ego is in place, or we really want to effectuate change. Now, I have this type of communique and dialogue. My tenor doesn't change. Like I said, I don't scratch when there's no itch, or dance when there's no music. When white folk are out of pocket, I'm letting them know on the mic, in the camera. Hello? When Negroes act like Negroes, I'm calling them out as well. Part of the real deal is that the issue of racism has never been addressed in this country, not even at a microscopic level. Let a court case come about. The judge is going to rule like we've experienced over the last 30 plus years, or 20 plus years in this case, since the late 80s, early 90s. Richmond versus Cronson, on. I mean, it's been just sort of lock them up, throw away the key. No more affirmative action, no more righting the wrong ship of centuries of injustice. And so the criminal justice system really reflects just that. And so that margin would say, okay, this is indicative of a society who has not dealt with its systemic ill. What's the real problem? The fact of the matter is, white folk and black folk, we still have some major issues. A lot of them prefer not to work with us, unless it's out of default. A lot of them feel as if there is no opinion or perspective that we should be really valued on. I mean, we're having this conversation, and I mean, you all working in the trenches as former prosecutors, et cetera, knowing damn well you see all of these black folk, and most of them lower income, poor, versus seeing an upper income white, and there's a major dichotomy when it comes to sentencing. Or it's sort of, it's nothing. They don't even put any real time and attention into preparing for the case. It's just sort of this tacit cold talk of, he or she's supposed to be in jail, so let's act accordingly. Politicians, we think the same way. And so when we're down in the Illinois House and Senate constantly trying to educate, at the same time fight our colleagues downstate or in the suburbs, or our wonderful white liberals on the north side, who knows what's best for all of us. And Hispanics, I'm telling you, y'all catching it too. And my Indian brothers and sisters, look, y'all darker than me. So, at night, you You could be anybody up here in this room. Don't get it twisted. I don't care what your pedigree is. You go to Chicago. They will lock your butt up. Then you have slave-minded Negro police officers who are still a part of that sort of ethos as well. So the point is, you want to somehow get to putting political pressure on your politicians at the state level nowadays. You got to press them. You got to find some soft point, some happy point, some strong point to connect with them. Now again, the trend is about it's costing us, our government's too much money. Human services, education, and prisons are costing the states there. I mean, the monies are running short in most states. And so you have to find a way to leverage that. And I talk about this black and white issue because it's real. Because I've been in those debates in the House and Senate Judiciary Committee. I sit next to a former federal prosecutor who just left a year and a half ago, who locked up some of our colleagues and worked on some pretty severe cases. And I always say, you know, when there's something in the paper, I say, look, this is another form of prosecutorial misconduct, where discretion, and I've always known that there was prosecutorial discretion as well, but they don't use when it comes to us on average, especially if you didn't finish high school, or if you had a couple of incidents or one incident with some federal offense. It can be sort of a floating checks. We lock people up in Illinois if you don't pay child support. And they're working, and you've already identified them. So us politicians, we have to sort of get into the genre of intelligent people, and we also have to listen to ex-offenders, the formerly incarcerated, and ask them what is it that we need to do as policymakers to really bridge this gap. And we need to also close the white and black and brown cultural chasm that is significant in our respective states, because we don't live together, and most of us don't. In some cases, don't want to work together, unless you're a super rich, black guy, or you're a super powerful black guy. And I hate that. I'm making it very simple, but that stuff is real. It's real when you go into some of these communities. You see abject poverty. It's real when you go to some of these. When you go into a court call at the county level, or the state level, or at the federal level, and you see a whole bunch of us in that room. So I don't apologize for this major distinction of who this justice is serving. It's not us.
Let me pick up on that point and just ask you to briefly comment on the following legislative fix. So I have a former colleague at the Harvard Law School who said that we need to localize criminal law, because, to use your example, they said if the impact of the laws of the children of Springfield politicians, he was talking about upstate, downstate, if their kids were going to jail at these rates and for these sorts of crimes, they would rewrite the law.
Absolutely.
But they don't feel the brunt of it. Is there a way to meaningfully localize the law and such that the communities that feel the brunt of laws have more say in how they are promulgated?
Because of this, that's a tough call. And again, the House and Senate in Illinois is predominantly white, and I have these conversations with my colleagues that I have the utmost admiration for, but they just don't want to get it. They think that would get them unelected. And here's what's really getting their attention is this methamphetamine. It's the new white crack cocaine for your rural areas, predominantly white folk. I mean, that's what's really getting everyone's attention. And they said, wait a minute, we have to come up with some preventive programs. The same things that the Black Caucus has been talking about in the state of Illinois for quite some time. And now it's coming into fruition. And keep in mind, I represent downtown Chicago. When you come to Chicago, you're usually having a good time of playing in my district. So again, my conversation on facts, empirical facts that's been illustrated here or pointed out, it is what it is. Also, I go from the Gold Coast to the Soul Coast. So know that you have to, Chicago, you can go with me, Ken Duncan, D-U-N-K-I-N, get my slave name correct. You have to find a way to connect with your state lawmaker. And you have to find a way to fancy their ego, but get to them and educate them, because the economics are. But with Dick Durbin, and I talk to Dick Durbin on too much of a regular basis. I know his wife his wife lobbies me, and as a matter of fact, his wife is a social worker. She lobbies for a lot of the organizations that have been discussed today. But at the same time, he should be making decisions like that, significant decisions like that, in a gym room with somebody who also is so aloof from what's really going on in some of these communities. Because I don't care, when you get your degrees, you're gonna have a cousin, uncle, probably your mommy or daddy that's been caught up in the system. That is a hindrance to them on the application to apply to a Harvard or Morehouse, where we went, or Spelman. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? On the FAFSA, have you ever been convicted of a felony? We should ban that box.
That's right.
When it comes to job applications. So you have to find a way to communicate with knuckleheads in the General Assembly, in the House and Senate, in every state legislature.
So let me just ask a couple more questions, then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. I want to direct this to both David Peterson and Benjamin Cheeks. So with all due respect to my Morehouse brother and a legislator, some would argue that, you know what, legislators don't really write the law. So I do this thought experiment with my first year students. I say, what's the speed limit on the highway? And they say, 55, 65 miles per hour. And I say, what if I told you the speed limit is whatever the state trooper sets his radar gun at? That's the speed limit. That's effectively the speed limit. So police discretion. Police are deciding who to stop, who to arrest. Police, the problem with Bill Stuntz localizing, and I've told him this when he was alive, is that, you can have the laws written in the same sort of way, but in some neighborhoods the police will, pour the beer out, take somebody home. In other neighborhoods, go to jail.
Station readjustment.
Right. In the schools, some places there's a fight, you get a good talking to. Other places, you're arrested. Police discretion, are they the ones really writing the laws?
Well, that's a very difficult question.
You're in school now, brother.
That's a very good question. I think my initial response is that they do have all the power. I mean, they're in the squad car by themselves. They make the decision on what happens. And I think what has to be done is that the people that are hired to do these jobs, that are hired to police, they need to be evaluated more stringently than what they are right now. My sister, she just moved to Kansas, and she just told me that's the most racist place she's ever been in her life. And we grew up in Georgia, lived in Florida, grew up all over the place. And she's surprised. She's surprised. She can't go out to a restaurant without being harassed by an officer. What are you doing here?
David, same thing, do you think? And as he's answering, if people have questions, you should start lining up behind the microphones and make a queue.
I think one place that I can speak to about localization is when police officers have the discretion of bringing a case to their local DA or to the federal prosecutor. A vast majority of my clients charged are kind of obvious federal cases, immigration cases and whatnot, drug cases that involve a kilo of meth. A small subset of my cases are crack cases, and I have yet to see a day where a prosecutor has brought a crack case against a defendant who was white, Latino, anything but black. And that comes down to the officers feeling like the local criminal justice system is not getting the right people, and so when they say, if we arrest this guy and charge him over in the state, he'll be back out in 18 months doing the same thing. We've had enough. We're taking him federal where he's going to get 15 years. That is a risk of localization, is that right now we have this dual system where cops can decide, and I don't know how often that happens across the country. It's a huge problem where I work, that cops work with local federal prosecutors to basically make this charging decision, to basically make the decision, I know we're in a liberal county in Texas and this person is not going to get hammered for being a small-time drug dealer, and they will get hammered if they go into federal court, so I'm going to make that happen.
All right, let's break for questions. We'll ask that you actually ask questions and let our panelists be panelists. But we ask that you ask a brief question so we can have time for everyone who wants to ask a question to be able to ask a question. So we'll start with the young woman on my left.
Hello. So my name is Colleen Fonseca. I'm an undergraduate studying government at St. John's University. So my question is, in this new wave of criminal justice reform, we tend to focus on what the criminal justice system has done and how to fix it solely. With this in mind, what role do zero-tolerance policies in public schools and discriminatory practices in college admissions play? And then also, how can this criminal justice movement employ different institutions to effectuate change?
Jessica, why don't you start off?
Thank you. So we've made a policy decision about how we want to deal with people. And we are privy to incarcerating instead of educating, and that has as much to do with our funding structures as it does with, the policies that we have in schools. So, you talk about zero tolerance policies. These people, my heart goes out to these teachers because they don't have the resources to cope with, students who don't have access to, early education programs or food or other social services that we once provided. And then they come to the schools and they have all of these issues that the teachers really can't deal with. And so they look for help, and the help that they're getting financially, and I would here we go talking about Obama again, but part of Attorney General Holder's Smart on Crime policy is to actually put more police in schools as a way to deal with, school violence and things of that nature. But it also drives zero tolerance policies because they're looking for another helping hand, and the helping hand that they're getting is the criminal justice system. That is a decision that we have made as society, and how we best fund certain people, certain issues. And we just feel better about incarcerating and having the criminal justice system there instead of saying, I'd rather invest in schools. I'd rather invest in, vocational training programs and things of that nature that will keep people out of the system. And so, again, I have to say it, a lot of it comes down to public messaging and having the public say, I think there's a better way that we can do this. There's a better way to spend our money.
Can I just add one thing about the zero tolerance? When I think of zero tolerance, I think of grade school zero tolerance for some reason. And there was a case, I think in Maryland recently, I'm not sure, where a boy chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun, and he got expelled from school for having a gun-shaped Pop-Tart. Now that kind of zero tolerance actually serves us so well because it shows the absurdity of zero tolerance and the absurdity of these mandatory penalties, whether it's expelling him from school is a mandatory penalty. So I think that in some of those lower level zero tolerance examples are actually very helpful in making people think, wait a minute, we may just be too narrow here and we need to be more thoughtful.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Brandon Moore. I'm Kennedy School graduate, 2013.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I think it's fantastic that there's some momentum behind like reducing sentences, getting rid of mandatory minimums, things like that. But as Michelle Alexander mentioned in her book, and you just mentioned, 95% of folks that are charged with something don't ever go to jail. Like the biggest problem.
They don't ever have a jury trial.
Don't ever have a jury trial. You're right. But the bottom line is. Right, the bottom line is they're pleading guilty, and they have a felony. So my question for the panel, and specifically for the representative, is what can we do to lobby our politicians to get rid of, or to reduce the amount of people that get felonies in the first place, and to ban the box so that people don't bear this unnecessary stigma for the rest of their lives?
Excellent question. Two things you can. What politicians fear the most is an angry, organized entity, especially one with some money. Now, there's a rule in my office. It's a standard rule that the calls I return are constituent because we find out who you are, what's your address. But if they're organized, if there are 30 or more people and they're fussing at me about a particular issue, I'm responding in writing. I'm setting up a meeting to connect with them. Again, most politicians, especially those of us who run every 2 years, forget 4 years, our concern is to get reelected. I'm speaking in general, not necessarily me. I mean, I say some nice, interesting things. I've been saying it for quite some time. Just Google it. The point of the matter is, if you're organized, if you have a voice, if you're clear with your message, we'll get it. And we'll respond in the affirmative. But come to us with some answers. Because you know what? We fake like we know it, we don't. The answers come from you, the constituents. But you all look at us as somebody who, that you work for us. We work for you. That's the best kept secret. Whether you're in Congress or whether you're in the Senate. We work for you, pay our salaries, you give us all this unnecessary deference, which is fine. I mean, we do have real power and access to areas and people that typically the average person wouldn't have. The other thing is to find somebody with some money who feel like some of these panelists up here and make that argument in that case. And you know, unfortunately, folk have to run across a negative experience before they really sort of come out of their bubble. But get organized, get somebody with some money, get in their face consistently, and come up with resolve for our particular epidemic. And it's as simple as that. And this works universally. Even if they can't stand your face, find a way to get their attention and put them on blast.
And I just want to add to that, I think very specifically, give FAM money. They have been working on this issue for 24 years.
I did not pay him to say that. I was going to say join FAM. Go to the website, FAMM.
Join FAM, give them money, join Families for Freedom, because basically organizations like that have member-based driven organizations are the reason that criminal justice, the reason that Eric Holder, the things that he's saying, criticize them for what's actually happening. The reason he's even saying that is because of FAM. The reason detention policies in America are being considered are because of Families for Freedom. Give those organizations money, support them, talk to them about what you can do.
Thank you so
Right.
much.
Question here.
So I wish we could pick this panel up and take you to Roxbury right now, because there's a simultaneous conversation happening exactly around this issue, jobs not jails, because of legislation here in Massachusetts. By the way, I'm Stefana, or Sunshine. I'm a radio personality as well as a grants manager, and we do support organizations that are working around the issues related to mass incarceration. And so as I listen to this conversation, I'm just wondering why we're not really talking about the prison industrial complex in terms of their culpability in disenfranchising communities around a host of different issues, including legislation that allows for new jails to be built as opposed to schools, and then gerrymandering communities. And so the question is, why are we not framing this conversation as with a communication strategy so that we're in front of it and that we're actively involving communities to oppose the modern day slavery that the prison industrial complex allows for other people or people who have vested interests to become more wealthy. And I just wonder if anybody could answer that.
Well, I'll just here's what's going on in Illinois. Right now, we're dealing with the private prisons system. You know, again, crime pays. $61 billion it costs to incarcerate Americans. $61 billion of your hard-earned or no-earned tax-paying dollars. I mean, it's an industry. As you say, it's just like healthcare and insurance. But you have to team up with those individuals of like-mindedness within your local region and make the case. The talking points that I have, that I've heard before even from this panel, comes from progressive groups in the state of Illinois, in the city of Chicago. They've been the ones who've been educating me. I just have a propensity, because I have a brother that's in the federal prison system, another brother just came out of the state system, my nephew is there, my sister, who recently passed, was back and forth out of the joint, and all of this was predicated off of crack cocaine. Robbing banks and cracking folk upside the head, shooting at the police. This is predicated off of that narcotic. And then a system that promotes separatism of resources, tacit approval by the black politicians. playing along to get along, conveniently ignoring realities in our respective community. And then there's the church component. In Chicago, let me speak with authority and clarity. Just start at 75th Street and drive to 55th Street. Every block, there's a 2.4 church presence there. And by the way, in the hood, they're on our prime corners. All these egos. I mean, what is really going on? They don't pay taxes for water, their cars, you show me one poor black preacher and I'll show you a man who ain't preaching. I mean, you know, from pimps, politicians, and preachers. I mean, there is a significant amount of preachers in our community. What are they doing? You know, pimping that Bible for what? Their own self-aggrandizement? Now, I go to Bishop Dr. Horace Smith's church, 38th in Indiana in Chicago. One, he's an incredible teacher. I'm inside of this world. But another reason, probably in the back of my big head, is that he's a noted hematologist or pediatrician. And as he tells us often, I don't need y'all money. I mean, he's a noted physician at Children's Memorial Hospital. And he teaches at Northwestern Medical School. So he really, and I've seen it. I mean, he walks the walk. He gives away everything that he has. Very humbly dressed, etc. But all I'm saying is, you know, to find one or two entities to build strength from and create the momentum. People basically, and I'll conclude, people basically are good people, especially when they find out the truth. And if they're with like-minded individuals. That's how things have been changed in this country. Starts with a younger generation. Older people say, man, I've always wanted to do that. Or they'll admire you for getting out there, you know, with some intestinal fortitude to get down with politicians who have no clue and don't even want to change anything. So, you know, it's not complicated. It's not rocket science. You don't need to have a bachelor's degree or a PhD. You simply need to get active and, you know, and find a real purpose that's real for real people.
Okay, so we've got 4 questions and 5 minutes left. So let us dictate ourselves accordingly with a brief question and brief answer. We'll get all 4 people in there. All right, sir.
I'll squeeze 2 questions into my 1 minute. Basically, to the former DA from Manhattan, what are the drug diversion courts? And I know Manhattan district is the worst, but basically as a form to reduce incarceration. If you can speak to that as one of the products or one of the systems that you use to reduce people, and why Manhattan district is the worst in NYC, speaking from knowledge. And also, thanks to the props, Dave, but I didn't pay him to say that either about families and freedom. The other issue that I love to bring up, which is from that question, is the private prison industry, but also the money they're pumping to you guys, because you just said somebody with money. But obviously, it does seem like it's those people with money coming to talk to you guys, and we have people locking us up massively making money off of it, which is drive. So the question goes back to Dave. The increasing prosecutions for making immigrants criminal, is that being driven by the private prison to tie into all the stuff about coming money and the legislators write the laws, and also to the DA, the drug diversion courts?
So drug diversion.
I'll speak briefly on that. In terms of New York specifically, I can't address that because I'm about 5 years removed from working in New York City. However, in the federal courts, there is a diversion program for individuals who have little criminal history or no criminal history, and that the amount of drugs is not as large as they normally see.
And diversion for the non-lawyers means people are diverted out of the criminal system, and cases are ultimately dismissed instead of processing through.
Correctly. They spend a year or two doing basically a type of probation, and then it's usually dismissed. However, I've noticed in the federal courts that when that is done, they don't look like me as often as they do.
And the second question was, is the increase in immigration due to the prison industrial complex? Do you think that's causative?
I can say this, that private prison companies give a lot of money to politicians, federal and state levels.
Yes, they do.
Private prisons are growing in the United States. Private prison companies gave a lot of money to a lot of federal politicians who mandated a minimum number of people who have to be detained by immigration, and that the fastest growing place for private prisons is among federal prisons, and the largest percentage of the folks who go there are people who are charged with immigration crimes. Now, does that mean that private prison companies are writing the laws, not just the laws that give them money and allow them to run these folks, but are they either writing the laws or preventing laws from changing that would ease up on drug crimes, ease up on immigration prosecutions?
All right, we're going to take these last three questions all together, and then the audience will respond. So, question one.
So, my question is with respect to heroin, and is that sort of viewed in the same light as crack cocaine with respect to reforms and looking at how you prosecute those who have heroin? Because a lot of folks may not know that it's not about the quantity of heroin, it's about the quality that they actually prosecute on. So if you have pure heroin, then that deems you to be a distributor and a kingpin. And so obviously, there's a mandatory sentence related to that. So I'm just curious about heroin versus crack.
Thank you. All right, next question.
So I feel that there are certain things that negatively impact the Black community, like pollution, imprisonment, and I'm wondering if there's anything in the pipeline that sort of a counter-racism legislation that can be put together by the good people who are in office. I know we don't have the money right off the bat that it takes to invest in lobbying, but some kind of legislation where if there's a law that negatively impacts 60% or more of a population, for example, the 25% of prison system that we make up when we're only 5% of the population, that some kind of legislation that can be put into the works to kind of counter that and offset laws like that from being made on a federal level. And I'm just making a point here, but if that kind of legislation was around when the Holocaust happened, it probably would have saved the Jewish community, and we all know how valuable they are.
Come on, man.
And the final question?
Hi, I'm Michelle Wilson from EPA, and I wanted to ask about the issue about what is low level and what is not. One of the reasons that I'm interested in that is because of crystal meth. The manufacture of that is made with very dangerous chemicals, and so what is low level, and if you can blow up the next apartment, what does that mean?
Right, that's right.
All right, so the first question, is heroin viewed in the same way as crack cocaine in terms of the harsh penalties? We can have one of...
I will just
and
take
brief
quickly.
answers, because I think we're out of time.
The answer is they are viewed the same. In other words, crack cocaine, even if you've got just a little bit of crack mixed with a lot of other ingredients, you're just going to weigh the drug. If you've got heroin mixed with a lot of other ingredients, you're just going to weigh the drug, and that determines your sentence.
And the second, because we really have to go, is this question on whether it's possible to engage in some kind of impact analysis legislation if a particular community is impacted disproportionately. Can you write that kind of legislation?
We can, but we need to put votes on it. It's a real challenge to pass legislation because whatever goes on in the House has to happen in the Senate. Whatever happens in the Senate has to happen in the House. It goes through committee for a second reading. It has to go through 3 readings in each chamber. It's an onerous task to pass legislation. That's why you need a mob with you hitting all various varying legislation on that respective committee, and then you have to work the floor. So it's yeoman's work if you don't have dollars to pass through, because the realities are you have lobbyists who take care of us, and I'm keeping it 100. They give us big donations, and they tend to get the audience and influence us more because they're spending more time with us. It's sad, but it's America.
And Benjamin Cheeks, the last word, I think you touched on this earlier. Who and how is the low level decided?
The low level
Who decides it and how is it decided?
for methamphetamine, it's statutory. For the mandatory minimum, it's 50 grams, which is a very small quantity, to trigger the 10-year mandatory minimum. But if it's mixed with something else, it's 500 grams.
And if there is environmental damage, the penalty is increased under the sentencing guidelines.
Never enough time. Please join me in thanking our panel.